on Zoom. And I wanted to start with the theme of knowing responsibility, as the president called it, that Communist China, and specifically the Chinese Communist Party, has for this virus and all of the knock-on effects. And Steve, maybe I could start with you. I'm calling to mind the old Howard Baker line from Watergate days. What did the Chinese Communist Party know, and when did it know it about the Wuhan virus?
Well, the Chinese Communist Party knew about it early. I think the first cases were in October, or at the very latest, the 1st of November. The central government, the National Health Commission, sent down to Wuhan in mid-December a group of scientists to investigate this new outbreak of an unknown pneumonia. And the central government, on the basis of that report, locked down the military bases in and around Wuhan on the 2nd and 3rd of January. So let's assume from that decision, which must have come from the Central Leadership Compound in Zhongnanhai and must have been approved by Xi Jinping himself, who's now has a new title, by the way. He's People's Leader. You know, it's not enough to be chairman of the Military Commission and General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and president for life. Now he's the People's Leader, which should send a chill through everybody who remembers the Mao Zedong era, the previous People's Leader. But Xi Jinping knew about it at the latest by the end of December. He locked down the military bases. That was almost the first thing that the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party did. And think about the significance of that. They wanted to make sure to protect at the outset the power, the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, Xi Jinping, who models himself on Chairman Mao in all things, can quote verbatim the entire Little Red Book of Chairman Mao, I'm sure, including the phrase, "Political power grows from the barrel of a gun." And so they decided to make sure that the guys with the guns in the military bases in and around Wuhan and the province of Hubei were not sick, but that they would be well armed and well equipped to deal with any unrest that was caused by the spreading pandemic. He didn't tell the world at that point. He didn't even tell his own people who were beginning to die. But he told the military, he put them on high alert. And then shortly after that, they sent in extra detachments of the People's Armed Police into Wuhan. Now, what normal government, what responsible government's first response to an epidemic is to put the military on high alert and send in reinforcements, Frank? I mean, this tells you all you need to know about the Chinese Communist Party.
Let me pull Brian into this. Brian, I think you're familiar with some of this timeline that Steve has just given us. There's also, I think, a very informative one that my colleague Mike Waller, and a member of the Committee on the Present Danger China, has posted at the Center for Security Policy site, securefreedom.org, and at the Committee on the Present Danger China site, presentdangerchina.org, which adds a lot more texture to what Steve has just given us. But Brian, before the Chinese started taking the steps that Steve has talked about, I think they were allowing the people of China to continue, including in central Wuhan, to congregate, to have potluck dinners, for heaven's sakes, for some 40,000 families. This speaks again to, I think, Steve's basic point that the attitude of the Chinese Communist Party towards the safety of their own people, the health and well-being of their own people, speaks volumes about the nature of this regime. Talk a little bit about what takeaways we should have concerning the party and its attitudes, both towards its own people and probably towards ours, for that matter.
Yes, Frank. Well, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. The problem with trying to understand this is the Chinese don't apply to the normal way of thinking anything that would approach what we in the West think of as human rights or decency or the role of a citizen. They don't really care if they lose people. Human life is not that precious to them. right? Whereas we in America and the West, we care about human life. We don't want to lose people. They see human life merely as a tool to achieve their communist objectives quite often. I mean, in the 20th century, some 100 million people or more died at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and their social experiments. And so in the case of this Wuhan virus, losing many tens of thousands of people or more, that might be the cost of doing business if in fact this has as I suspect, a more political purpose. That if you look at, flus in general, many of them, most of them emanate from China to begin with. So that China is very familiar with the idea of what a flu can do to a society. So this occurs in Wuhan, and they let people go from Wuhan to the rest of the world, but not from Wuhan to the rest of China, meaning they immediately had some idea that this was either very serious or they wanted to make a political point about it. And so when this starts to occur in, some timelines have it as early as October, but it's hard to document it until November, December, January. But once it really starts happening, and the mere fact that the Chinese government lets people go from Wuhan to the rest of the world, but not the rest of China, one suspects that there is something going on here. That should be of great concern to anybody. But I think one key point is that the US government asked about that time for access to Wuhan, and they were not granted it, even though the US government has CDC offices in China. It was not given access. Now, if you're a US policymaker or an analyst looking at all this, what must you have thought about what was going on in Wuhan? That would have had to have spooked a lot of people from the US government as to how serious this might be.
Well, yes and no. I guess on the other hand, what the Chinese were saying at the time, Steve, as I understand it, and certainly what their puppets at the World Health Organization were saying at the time was, there's nothing to see here, folks, move along. That basically it's not something that can be transmitted from person to person, and it's not that contagious, and the deaths are not that high, and so on. Could you give us a flavor of the narratives that the Chinese Communist Party were pushing out, Steve, and the extent to which it did conceal from us for critical periods of time the true magnitude of this problem and how we should have been preparing to contend with it?
Well, I think our mistake from the beginning was taking anything that came out of the mouths of Communist Party officials at face value, because their fallback position, their default position, is really to deceive and practice deception. And I think that comes from the very nature of a conspiratorially organized Communist Party, which is divided into cells. They keep information from each other. They're Machiavellian by design. They're officially atheistic, so they have no regard for any higher truth. And in fact, a communist Chinese official, and I've had a lot of dealings with them over the years, if they can achieve their ends by telling you the absolute honest truth, or can achieve the same end by telling you a fiction, they will tell you a fiction often because they count themselves clever in deceiving an innocent, naive American. And of course, many innocent, naive Americans have been deceived in this dealing with the China coronavirus, deliberately, I think, on the part of Chinese officialdom. But let's go back to January 7th. There was a meeting of the National Health Commission convened to deal with the spreading epidemic in China, which they knew very well was spreading in the city of Wuhan and the surrounding province and other parts of China by then. And the head of the National Health Commission outlined the priorities of the Chinese government as, number one, protecting the power and prestige of the Chinese Communist Party. That's number one. Number two, quarantining those who have the infection. That's number two, distant number two, by the way. And an even more distant number three is the safety of the Chinese people finding a cure. We'll worry about that after we quarantine the sick, and we'll worry about quarantining the sick after we protect the power of the Chinese Communist Party, so that nothing that happens in this spreading epidemic will interfere with our efforts to absolutely dominate China and to continue with our plan to dominate larger parts of the world. So that was the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party in this crisis. And I would say, Frank, the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party in every crisis. And now we have coming out of China, the myth that China has completely conquered the China virus, and that the only cases occurring in China are those brought in by those infected foreigners. How dare they? And the rest of the world should look to China as a model for how to deal with the pandemic, and they should ignore the experience of the United States, because, as the Global Times said just a couple of days ago, the free market economy is chaotic, America is in crises, democracies can't deal with epidemics like this. Look to China as a model of order, regularity, and dealing with the pandemic. So that's the propaganda line they're putting out to the world. But Americans need to know
I'm fond of calling this the idea that communism is a cure for COVID-19. And
Right.
I think what you've demonstrated here, Steve, is that ain't necessarily so. But I wanted to ask you one other question about this, Steve. We'll bring Brian back in. But the question that is top of mind for me on this matter of what did they know and when is the nature of the laboratory from whence it seems this disease sprung. I've heard you on Fox News and elsewhere, Steve, talking a bit about this. We've visited about it on our Secure Freedom radio show. But what do we actually know? What seems to be at least the emerging consensus about where this disease came from? Was it this so-called wet market or an actual laboratory of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, let's talk about the emerging consensus, and then we'll take it one step further. But the Chinese Communist cover story is that it came from a wet market. That cover story is absolutely obliterated. It is blown. It is a fabrication. We know that because there are no intermediate horseshoe bats. That's what the species is called, the intermediate horseshoe bat. There are no intermediate horseshoe bats sold, butchered, eaten at the Wuhan wet market. An early report dating back to the end of January, early February, from two Chinese scholars, both surnamed Xiao. The two doctors, Xiao, went to the wet market, interviewed 59 people, and they all attested to the fact that there were no horseshoe bats sold at the wet market. And the best proof that the Chinese cover story is just that, a cover story, is that the Chinese Communist authorities have now reopened the wet market. Why would, if the wet market was the epicenter of an epidemic that has devastated China's economy and the world, why would they reopen it? I think the fact that they reopened it belies their cover story. If it had actually been the wet market that was the source of the China virus, they would have burned it to the ground. There would be nothing but a desert left there. They wouldn't have reopened it. Now, what do we know about the lab? We know there were thousands of horseshoe bats in the lab, and I literally mean thousands. In one study I looked at, they were using 600 horseshoe bats for one study of one infection protocol. They also had isolated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology over the last 10 years, 2,000 new viruses. Now, that sounds like a large number of viruses, but that's actually as many viruses have been isolated in that lab in the last 10 years as the entire scientific research of the entire world has isolated in the last 200 years. This is an incredible number of coronaviruses, mostly isolated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were in a frenzy, an absolute frenzy of collecting coronaviruses from horseshoe bats, from the urine, from the feces, and isolating them in the lab. But they weren't only doing that. They were also using recombinant technology to do what's called gain of function research on these bat coronaviruses. What is gain of function research? Well, it is gain of function research is where you take an existing coronavirus and you make it more lethal, you make it more infectious. Why would you do such a thing? Well, the idea of gain of function research, which began in the United States 20 years ago when we began to use recombinant technology, the idea was that we're going to create superbugs in the lab which don't exist in nature. And we're going to do that because we want to do some sort of preventative research to make sure that we know how to handle superbugs, that we have the right drug therapies, that we have vaccines, that we can develop a treatment protocol. Well, that's all fun and games as long as you keep those superbugs in the lab. But if you create a superbug and you let it leak out before you figured out a vaccine or a drug regimen, then you've just unleashed a pandemic upon the world. Now, we know the woman in charge of the coronavirus research and the Wuhan Institute of Virology was a woman named Dr. Shi Zhongli. She's published in medical journals dozens of articles, and she was using recombinant technology to enhance existing coronaviruses. I think this was one of hers. There's no question that it leaked from a lab in my mind, but there's also very little question in my mind that it's one of hers. She took an existing bat coronavirus and made it more lethal, made it more infectious. And I believe that's what we're dealing with today. And I think this accounts for the extraordinary length to which the Chinese government has gone to disappear people, doctors, to disappear researchers, to disappear research papers, and to try to turn the blame on us, Frank. We're accused of having created a bioweapon at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and having seeded it into China, which I think is a cover story that kind of reveals a lot about what the Chinese Communist Party is.
As usual, the practice of deflection. So, Brian, having heard all of that, and I think having some, serious thoughts and understanding of the wellspring of this kind of behavior from the Chinese Communist Party, I would just ask you, if the Chinese lab, which as I understand it, Steve, is on a military installation that has been associated with the biological weapons program of China, but if this lab is engaging in recombinant engineering of viruses to enhance the gain of function, if you will, is it possible that what this was really about was not simply trying to improve vaccines against exotic diseases, but actually perhaps building a bioweapon and having a capability to inoculate your team against its effects so that it could be used against somebody else's? Is that, I'm not saying that there's conclusive proof of this, I'm just interested in your thoughts about that possibility.
No, that's a good question. And I think you and I were joking the other day that we have to be careful not to sound conspiratorial about these things.
Heaven forfend.
Yeah, right. No, we want to be sensible about this. I think Steve lays out a very compelling case that, in fact, China does do this kind of research. Why do they do this kind of research? Well, they want to know a lot of things. They want to be able to understand all these viruses that occur both naturally and that might be man-made. But one wonders at some fundamental level what they were thinking during this whole process. Were they thinking, okay, we're doing this kind of research and someone just got sick and this is spreading throughout Wuhan. What should we do? And then there were members of the Communist Party sitting around a table trying to sort out what they must do to address this. And then what role will President Xi make in this decision-making process? What will we do here with this? Now, someone said, well, we can't let people from Wuhan go around the rest of the country because we don't want this spreading. That I actually don't think it's as lethal as we originally thought. And some of the numbers coming from, at least here in the United States, suggests that it's not that lethal, but in fact, it is very infectious. And so you can see where people in the Communist Party would have thought, well, we don't want this to spread throughout China. And then someone thought, well, there's a lot of people from Wuhan going to, the United States and to Europe. Should we stop the flights going there? And then someone made a decision at the highest levels of the Chinese government. Yes, we're going to let that happen, period. Now, when
at the very least, the results of that being that you're proliferating the likelihood of transmission of this disease to foreign countries. And there's a lot of evidence now that the Chinese were a cause of that proliferation. And I don't mean to interrupt you there, Brian, but I just wanted to make sure that one of the things that we're laying out here is this is part of a comprehensive activity that the Chinese have engaged in for some time. There's a report from a Chinese defense minister some 2 decades ago to the effect that the Chinese, from Deng Xiaoping's day forward, wanted to have a covert biological weapons program and actually had in mind its use against the United States to eliminate its population so it could be replaced by the excess population of communist China. And Steve, you've studied this population control business intensively. What would you say about that report of a biological weapons program? And do you think this laboratory, in fact, was part of it?
Well, I think the Wuhan Institute of Virology was one of 2 laboratories, one outside of Beijing and one there in Wuhan, that was doing bioweapons research. Now, there are Western virologists who have visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology and said, oh, they weren't doing any bioweapons research there. They were doing pure scientific research. And you have to ask yourself, how would they even know? Right. These are naive Western researchers who are interested in the pure science of the matter. They're dealing with Chinese researchers, some of whom may be pure researchers, but many of whom are members of the Chinese Communist Party and share the party's agenda, which is not the agenda of your ordinary scientific researcher interested in the pure pursuit of human knowledge, advancing the frontiers of human knowledge, and that sort of thing. And so there is a party organization within the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The senior people at the Wuhan Institute of Virology are all party members. The leading party member of the Wuhan Institute of Virology probably has more power, pure political power, of course, raw political power, than the formal head of the institute, who in a sense is a figurehead. He manages the scientific research, but the party leader actually decides what the policy is going to be. So they have a program there. Western visitors would never even know of its existence. Most of them, almost all of them, unless they could read, write, and speak Chinese, could come right up to a door on which was written in Chinese, bioweapons lab. And they would have no idea what they were looking at because they can't read Chinese. Now, I would know what I was looking at because I could read, write, and speak Chinese, but most of the Western researchers wouldn't. And the other researchers who will not speak about a word about bioweapons research in China are generally people who have some kind of research connection with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It has been very active, Frank, in bringing scientists in from other parts of the world. This is part and parcel of the 1,000 Talents program. You bring in Western researchers, you show them your lab, you tell them what you're doing, and then you say, do you have any suggestions for us? You pick their brain. You get their cutting edge technology, and then you apply it to your own research.
This speaks to a phenomenon that I think operates widely in certainly the American scientific community, and that is it's all one big fraternity with whom you can share all kinds of information and never mind that the people that you're dealing with may well be actually working in ways that would be highly detrimental to your country's national security, as long as it's done in the sort of idea of this scientific partnership. Anything goes. And Steve, this reminds me, I just have to share this story with you. Your insight is so valuable. I remember many, many years ago when I was working in the Reagan Defense Department, having a briefer come in from the Defense Intelligence Agency to talk to me about biological warfare, because I think at the time I was worrying about the unverifiability of the Biological Weapons Convention, to which the Chinese Communist Party, of course, is a party, but has taken full advantage of the fact that it's totally unverifiable. And I remember him saying very vividly, pointing to a closet in my office space, that there could be a biological weapons incubation system inside that closet, and nobody's sitting where we were, let alone walking down the hall, let alone outside of the building, would have any idea what was going on. So I think your point is very well taken. And I guess, Brian, just to you, if you know this about that facility, and our scientists may be loath, another point really, another concern is that our scientists may be loath to point out some of the problems with these kinds of facilities, a dual use problem specifically, because they don't want to jeopardize their own research back where they may be coming from here in the United States. But again, does this give rise to a further concern about the knowing responsibility of the Chinese Communist Party about this outbreak, that the source of the disease was in this facility, and as Steve has said, it almost certainly was something that was being engineered by at least some of the team there. This raises really a huge question about culpability, I guess, doesn't it?
Yes, no, I think that's right. I don't want to lose the thread of what you just suggested, because I think that's the key point. Yes, of course they're going to do bioweapons research, and Steve has laid that out perfectly. That's going to go on, that was going on. What you don't want, though, the next conclusion to be, well, accidents happen. And because they happened, then, unfortunate things occurred. That in fact, it was taking that virus from that lab, it went to a human, but then it went to all sorts of humans throughout Wuhan. The thread I don't want to lose, though, is it then was, as a matter of high government policy, spread to the rest of the world. So even if it didn't start out as a bioweapon that was intentionally used to kill Americans and other people in the West, at the moment the Communist Party and the communist officials decided to let people from Wuhan go to the rest of the world, it may not have been a bioweapons attack, but it sure looks like one at that point.
Right.
And so even
at the very least, a dress rehearsal for one might say, don't you think?
Well, right. No, I mean, but this is a distinction without a difference at some important point here. At that one fundamental level that Xi Jinping signed off on people from Wuhan going around the world, this has all the appearances of a bioweapon. And again, our president, President Trump, has asked that be investigated. And I'm sure it will be investigated. Yeah. But it's a very high standard.
Whether specifically this was an accidental
release
or there was some intentionality to it, I think is what he's asked especially to be addressed, right?
Right. No, he has. But he does want to find out who really is responsible here. Mm-hmm. And I think just on its face, once they let people go from Wuhan to the rest of the world, they are responsible.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do you make them pay?
Right. Well, Steve, I want to come to that too. There's one other element of this that I want to draw you out on. When the Chinese began facilitating, I guess Brian would put it, facilitating the dispersal of this disease, they sort of compounded the problem by both withholding hoarding, if you will, a lot of the equipment that would be needed to minimize the damage that it was causing in countries that were in the process of being infected. and then selling, not giving, but actually selling such equipment at a very high markup, I might add, but often it being defective. This further raises the concern, especially with the WHO role in all of this, shilling for the Chinese Communist Party and essentially propounding their lies of collusion, complicity, and real malevolence. Does it not?
Well, it's all of those things and more. I mean, this is the worst catastrophe, I think, ever to befall humanity. By the time all is said and done, by the time the economic cost, the human cost, the suffering is all added up, this will be more suffering probably than any of the world wars of the last century by the time we're all done. But Brian's absolutely right. Even if this wasn't designed to be a bioweapon, it has been used as a bioweapon by the Chinese Communist Party because it has been deliberately spread around the world. We had that report out of what the University of Southampton, I think in England, which said that if the Chinese government had been transparent about the first few cases, 95% of the deaths could have been avoided. It could have been contained probably to the city of Wuhan and not spread throughout the world, and the world's economy would be humming along at a good pace. That didn't happen because of the deliberate deceit practiced by the Chinese Communist Party. So they're responsible for all of this. And then to add insult to injury, in January, before the world knew China had a problem, and they didn't know China had a problem because China was deceiving the world and deceiving. I don't know if they had to really deceive Dr. Tedros at the World Health Organization. I think they just gave him his script and said, this is what you say. And he parroted exactly what his Chinese communist masters and promoters wanted him to say. But in January, before the world knew there was a problem, before the Chinese people knew there was a problem, an order went out from Beijing to all of China's agents overseas to buy PPE, personal protective equipment, masks and gowns and so forth, to buy respirators, ventilators, to buy medical supplies they would need for this pandemic they were about to unleash on the world. I know, for example, from my friends in Australia, that they absolutely wiped out the entire supply of PPE and masks and respirators in Australia. When they started getting the first few cases in Australia, they quickly ran out. They went to the stores and they were bare because China had sent in private cargo jets to a private runway that they ran on one of their mines in Australia and were carting this stuff out of Australia by the ton. Australia had to buy some of it back at as you say, Frank, at exorbitant prices. What do we call that? I mean, this is ghoulish behavior, profiteering from people who are suffering. Hoarding supplies.
It's economic warfare.
Yeah, it's economic warfare. So it's not only biological. It's economic warfare. I mean, we know that they've been attacking us across all domains except the kinetic for the last 30 years, all right? The cyber domain, right? Space, everywhere. And now we have a new domain, and we're waking up to the fact that they're attacking us now across the health domain by threatening the well-being of the American people and the people of the world. This is unrestricted warfare. And I know you remember that book from 1999, written by two senior PLA colonel strategists who said we need to wage unrestricted warfare on the United States to defeat them and become the preeminent power in the world. This is another aspect of unrestricted warfare.
I believe it was actually mentioned as one of the options for them, some 20 of which were laid out in that very important book, Steve. And I guess that brings me to the money question. So if we have established, and presumably in due course, the US government's investigation that Brian referred to will arrive at similar conclusions, that not only did the Chinese know about this disease from the get-go, but they were responsible for it, and they compounded the problem it caused by disseminating it worldwide, withholding some of the protective equipment and so on. The effect of which, to my way of thinking, is they've terrified, just to say with the United States for a moment, they've terrified the American people. They've devastated our economy, and they've sidelined our military. at least out in the Western Pacific, temporarily, hopefully, but nonetheless, all without firing a shot. And this really is, if nothing else, I think, to the point both of you have made, a proof of concept of a biological weapons laydown and its effectiveness. And if it turns out it was more than that, that much the worse. But the question I just would put to both of you in closing is, if there is this kind of guilty knowledge, if there is this knowing responsibility, as the president put it, what should we do about it? Steve, maybe I can start with you.
Well, I think there's a whole long list of things we can do about it. We can waive China's sovereign immunity and allow American citizens and states, I think, like what Missouri is already doing. Missouri's Attorney General has filed a lawsuit against the People's Republic of China. I hope it goes forward. We can, one of the things that I think we have to do is we have to facilitate individual choice in this matter. We know that 80% of Americans are now not very well disposed towards the country that caused a global pandemic. And we should modify, I think, the country of origin labeling to ensure that online retailers make sure that when they post information about a product, that it has to include the country of origin. If I know that something being sold on Amazon is made in China, I'm not going to buy it. But I can't find out, Frank and Brian, whether it is or not, because it won't, Jeff Bezos won't tell you. I want him to tell me. I want him to be forced to tell me. I want to see that labeling increase. There has to be a minimum type size. The American consumer now needs to boycott made in China goods.
There's a campaign underway, I think, Steve, to the effect of labeling things not made in China, which would be a good start, don't you think?
There we go. We can do that too. So allow the American consumer a choice, and I think we will see a move away from Chinese products, a permanent move away from Chinese products. I think we need to enlist our allies in this as well. How well disposed do you think the Prime Minister of Great Britain is after spending a week in the hospital, very ill with the China virus?
Intensive care.
I think Huawei is out of the British 5G network. I think Boris Johnson has already said there'll be other consequences. The main German newspaper just sent a butcher's bill to Beijing of $139 billion of the cost of the economy and the cost to the German people.
Just to the Germans.
Virus. So join with our allies. And lots of things we can do. I'm sure Brian has some suggestions in that regard.
Brian, I did want to hear yours as well.
Well, I agree with Steve on all those. I think that all seems more or less very sensible. Why should the Chinese be rewarded in any way for this very bad behavior? I noticed some congressmen are talking about, and senators are talking about defaulting on the US Treasury bonds that the PRC holds, which I think today add up to over $1 trillion. I think that would be a bad idea, actually, even though a lot of our friends and allies think that's a good idea. Why would we default on our own sovereign debt and hurt the United States credit rating? There's also this talk, as you suggest, Steve, of suing, suspending the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act and then suing somewhere, but that somewhere is going to be an international court. I think the Chinese would delay that for years and years. And because they're so good at corrupting international institutions, there'd be no guarantee we'd get a fair hearing in that court. So doing the kind of things you're suggesting make, to me, more sense. There's also an issue that some of us have been involved with for some time, totally unrelated to the Wuhan virus, but the whole question that China is also in default on their own sovereign debt held by 20,000 families here in the United States. 20 years ago, the American Bondholders Foundation was created simply to try to collect on China's defaulted sovereign debt that these 20,000 American families hold. And, these are gold bonds of a gold loan, and, the value is very, very high. I think that could be, for the president, a very useful vehicle for getting some remuneration for the American people. Make a deal that paid off the bondholders and also made for the American people a substantial amount of money, and try to use that to help repair our economy. The Chinese like money. They care about money. They're engaged in economic war against us. That's why they scooped up all that PPE. They use that to both hurt us and to make money. Okay, well, if they like making money and they do think this is an economic war, show them that both sides can participate in that. Now, it turns out actually trying to collect from China on the defaulted sovereign debt that they hold would actually be just enforcing normal law. You're supposed to honor your sovereign debt. And so whatever we can do to make China play by the rules that every other country on earth plays by seems to me a good thing. And they need to know, regardless, that there are consequences to doing what they've done here. To have started this awful pandemic with the economic and the cost in human life, that's remarkable. If we treat this as if this was just an accident somehow, we will not be serving the American people very well. And I think the American people will look at this time in our history, and if we just let this go as an accident, I think the American people will think they were not well served by their government.
Well, and they may not recover from it either, depending on how this thing plays out. Let me just add one other item to this litany, because I think you both have made very good suggestions. At the very least, whether we're going to punish them in one way or another, whether we're going to recover costs in one way or another, there's one other thing that we certainly need to be doing, I believe, and that is we need to stop underwriting the threat that Communist China and the Chinese Communist Party represent to us. This has been one of the dirty little secrets, I guess one might say, of Wall Street investing, institutional investors and private individuals, savings funds, their retirement funds and the like, in Chinese Communist Party associated companies. And the effect has been to enable them to do, well, the whole host of things that you were alluding to there a moment ago, Steve, in terms of asymmetric warfare. Some of these companies have been sanctioned by the United States government for their behavior, their proliferation activities, their human rights abuses. And yet, while it's illegal to do business with these companies, it's still possible to invest in them, which makes it therefore possible for them to continue doing business. This is madness. It has greatly enhanced the power of enemies of this country. And I'm just saying, there's a specific issue that's very, very time sensitive at the moment, because we are at the cusp of seeing the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, as it's called, an innocuous, heretofore almost unknown agency in the United States government that oversees the federal government's thrift retirement plan, or federal savings, retirement savings plan. They are about to migrate perhaps as much as $50 billion in the retirement funds of American servicemen and women and other federal government employees into some of these Chinese companies, including several that are manufacturing the weapons that the Chinese have designed and are deploying for the purpose, make no mistake about this, of killing those same servicemen and women and perhaps the rest of us. This is outrageous, I think we can all agree, and must not proceed. And I just want to close this conversation with Brian Kennedy, the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, Stephen Mosher, the president of the Population Research Institute, member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China, and myself working with the committee to commend to our listeners the work of the committee. The presentdangerchina.org website is an invaluable resource. There is a petition there that you can sign and send to President Trump and your representatives in Congress, urging them not to fund Chinese companies through our thrift savings plan. And I really entreat you all to take very much to heart this idea that there is unquestionably knowing responsibility on the part of the Chinese Communist Party for what has befallen us. And the question really is, will they profit from it? Will they benefit in other ways from it? And will they, in fact, find in all of this further impetus behind their ambition to become the dominant power in the world, to the great detriment of our people, our freedoms, and I believe those of others worldwide as well. So permit me to say again, thank you to our superb panelists. Thank you to those of you who have been listening to this Zoom broadcast and who will get it on YouTube subsequently. We hope that you will make the Committee on the Present Danger of China a regular resource by visiting frequently presentdangerchina.org. I'm Frank Gaffney. Thank you very much for listening. Over and out.